Hello, and welcome to Academic Perspectives on Conspiracism, a podcast about the research that's being done on the place of conspiracy theories in society, culture, and politics. Each episode is a conversation with an academic about their research on a different aspect of conspiracism. I'm Adam Coper, a postdoctoral fellow with the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data here at Cardiff University. This week, I'm speaking with Dr. Susannah Crockford from the University of Exeter about the connections between spirituality and conspiracy theories. In this conversation, we also talk about the wellness industry, focusing on the infamous case of the Goop jade egg. Dr. Crockford is a lecturer in anthropology at Exeter and has written on manifestation, spirituality, and their connection to neoliberalism. Her book, Ripples of the Universe, Spirituality in Sedona, Arizona, was published in 2021 by the University of Chicago Press. She's also the host of the Misinformation podcast, which I really recommend you check out if you've not done so already. Welcome, Susannah. Did I miss
Hi.
anything from your bio, or is that all right?
No, that was great. Hi. It's lovely to speak with you today, Adam.
Nice to have you here. So just to kick us off, so you're an anthropologist specializing, I guess, in sort of religion or new religious movements. Is that the correct term? Oh no, is it Easter? Find that the language here is confusing for me as someone who's got no background into this. The esotericism, new religious movements, spiritualism. So could you kind of give us a rundown of your specific
Yeah.
area?
No problem. The language is hard, I would say, and it's really easy to step on mines in the minefield of religion talk, which I will help you with right now. So I'm an anthropologist. I study religion. I also study medicine. I also study environment. So those are the three sort of kind of broad areas that I study from an anthropological perspective. My first book was about spirituality. So we should be careful here with the term spirituality. It is not the same as spiritualism. Spiritualism is talking to spirits of the dead, and there is spiritualist churches, and it emerged in late 19th century America. Spirituality is different. So spirituality, at least the way I use it, I'm talking about what a lot of people would call New Age spirituality or the New Age movement, although no one really calls it the New Age movement anymore. And if you talk to people who do these things, they use crystals, they do yoga, and they kind of dance around in fields near Bristol at festivals, then, I mean, I live in the West Country, I live in Devon, so, I am very much among my people right now. But they don't call themselves New Agers. And people in Sedona, which is in Arizona, where I first did my fieldwork, they also don't call themselves New Agers. So I really had this conflict, which is that the term in religious studies is New Age, but no one actually likes that anymore. No one wants to call themselves it. So I talk about spirituality, which doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because spirituality can mean a number of different things, right? You can have Christian spirituality, you can have Jewish spirituality. It's sort of the sense of an interior sense of a religious practice. So these lines between what is religion, what is spirituality are very blurry. And but the people who do the kinds of practices I study, they just call it spirituality. They're really not that concerned with terminological issues, whereas scholars of religion are. They're extremely concerned.
Right.
So I always have to kind of be very clear. It's well, from the scholarly perspective, this is what we call it. This is different from the perspective that from people themselves. Um, and then esotericism is the other word you managed to bring in there as well. Esotericism is a very specific type of religious studies. They look at hidden, secret, rejected currents of knowledge, mostly in Europe, although that's changing now. Historically, it was called Western esotericism, although the Western's been critiqued quite a lot. And it is mostly studied by historians of religion. So as an anthropologist, I do study what you might call contemporary esotericism, but a lot of the sort of more kind of historians of religion who study esotericism wouldn't necessarily acknowledge what I study as esotericism. They sort of look down on New Age. That's the problem with New Age spirituality. Everyone seems to look down on it.
Right. I guess to speak in more kind of concrete terms, you've sort of given us a hint already that you've been kind of interested in things like crystals, the Goop jade egg, which we'll get onto, and those sort of I don't know how would you describe them? How would you characterize those practices of yoga? And because yoga is something that a lot of people do, so I presume that you're not just looking at yoga generally.
No, in fact, there's a subdiscipline of yoga studies where they do that.
Oh,
And I also wouldn't put myself in yoga studies, although I do practice yoga. So this is why I tend to talk about spirituality, and I talk about spirituality as a sort of umbrella term that incorporates a lot of different practices. It used to be quite common to define what you can call New Age in terms of the practices people do. So it was things like astrology, yoga, meditation, crystals, la 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 la. I don't think it's very convincing to define a term as a list of practices, right? That's sort of like defining Christianity in terms of prayer. Lots of people pray. Lots of people do yoga. That doesn't mean they're doing spirituality. So I have my own definition that I developed, like a good religious studies person, about what is spirituality. And this is very much it's an ethnographic description, which means it really comes from the way that the people that I studied in Sedona, and now I'm studying people similarly in Devon and Somerset, Glastonbury and Totnes, who the way they use these terms, right? So the definition that I came up with, which you can find in my book, but very briefly, I define rather spirituality as organized around the principle of energy. So the energy is the central organizing concept of spirituality. Everything is energy and all energy vibrates at a certain frequency. So if you listen to people talk about this kind of thing, they will constantly talk about this kind of thing like, oh, that's got good vibes, or I'm trying to raise my vibration. And that this has a purpose, right? You're trying to raise your vibration and your frequency in order to ascend to a higher dimension. And this is what sometimes called the shift. It's sometimes called the ascension. In astrological terms, it's kind of the shift from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, which if you're really old, you might remember the musical Hair and the song, The
is that
Age
the
of
one with the song?
Aquarius.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I've heard that song. I
Well,
didn't
that's
know it
about
was
the
from
same
Hair,
idea.
but
Yeah. Yeah, it was shocking in the 1960s. So, but you say it now and people are like, what are you talking about? Anyway, so it's this idea that everything's going to change, right? And this was the original, at least theosophical idea of the New Age, right? It was this new era of spiritual peace and harmony. And the way that people involved in spirituality think that's going to happen is by everyone individually raising their vibration to ascend to this higher dimension. So there's this millenarian aspect to it, right? The current order, which is materialistic and full of suffering and war, that's going to end. And we're going to enter this new spiritual era, the New Age, right? They prefer to talk about like the paradigm, the new paradigm, or the shift, because again, this whole like the language of the New Age has really fallen out of favor. So there's a lot of different words that you can use to describe it, but they all kind of mean the same idea of everything changes so that we all start to become more spiritual, however that looks.
okay. I think it was interesting that you said about individuals kind of working on themselves, I suppose, to achieve this shift. And I think that points to something that I find very interesting in your research is the kind of link to neoliberalism, which is itself kind of very focused on the individuals as opposed to any community or broader movement. And do you think that spirituality, as you've studied it, is highly individualist, and does it have a tendency towards, I don't know, does it have a sort of, what's the word? Is it neoliberal, basically, is what I want to ask.
Yes, so I do talk about neoliberalism a lot, especially in my book. Um, but the thing about spirituality is that the way that you raise your vibration is that you follow your own spiritual path. Now, this sounds very individualistic, right? You can discern your own spiritual path. That's part of being on your spiritual path, is figuring out what it is. And amongst all those many practices that I've mentioned, you can decide what it is. It could just be meditating for you. A lot of people in Sedona would say it was just being out in nature, like going on nice hikes. It's a very beautiful place, right? You go on some nice hikes. That was how they lived their spiritual path. So each person discerns or decides their own specific spiritual path, and we all do it separately from one another. It's not like a traditional church congregation. We're not doing this together through the kind of intercession of an intermediary between us and the divine, right? The divine is in all of us. It's panentheistic, right? We are all part of what they call the oneness spirit. right, because we're all energy, so we're all part of this same substance, so therefore we don't have to work together because we are all in fact already the same thing. So it sounds individualistic, but if you're going to be really technical about your religious studies terms, it's monistic, because we're all of this oneness, right? We're all of the same substance, which is what they call the universe, right? If you've ever talked to people who are into this, they might say things like, well, the universe wants you to have this, or the universe told me to do this, right? So the universe is the idea of divinity. We're all part of the universe. We're all part of the same energy of it. So we don't actually have to work together, right? Because we're all already the same. So that's why the idea of it being individualistic is sort of, in a way, it kind of mistakes the cosmology, but in another way, I think that there is a level of individualism in the way that it works out in practice, which is that people do just sit on their own doing their own practice, and they don't really like working in groups. They don't really like getting on with each other. But on the other hand, the spiritual path, although theoretically it can be absolutely anything, tends to take these very conventional forms. So even though they're all being very individual in their spiritual paths, they all tend to do, it's within a range of certain options. So theoretically in spirituality, because they think that all of the various world religions are just kind of surface expressions of the same thing, right? The oneness of the universe. So that's why they get accused of cultural appropriation a lot, because they think it's totally okay to just use whatever religious or cultural practice. So that's why, and the sort of worst excesses of spirituality is people dressing up like Native Americans and running sweat lodges, for example.
Okay.
They also like to do Buddhist practices a lot. There's a really strong influence of Buddhism in the meditation, the yoga. They will always talk about Buddhism. They will never talk about Hinduism. If they want to talk about Hinduism, they will talk about Vedic religion, which
Right.
is a kind of more ancient source. Like the Vedas are ancient texts, and Hinduism is a term that came around in the 19th century. So there's this sort of dislike of engaging with certain types of religion. So I never heard anyone, for example, going on a spiritual path that involved Islam in any way,
Okay.
right? It was like, yeah, they could be Native Americans, they could be Buddhists, but no one would ever want to be a Muslim. And I think there's something interesting about that and the sort of cultural politics that is involved in spirituality. But that's what I mean by like the individuality of it, the individualism of it seems it's probably a bit more surface level. And if you look deeper on this, kind of these are quite strong cultural trends that, bind people together. But when neoliberalism comes along, is that I was specifically looking at the political economy. So how do people organize themselves? How do they make money, right? In a
Hmm.
traditional church setting, at least in America, and this holds true for many religious collectivities, you have your congregation, you have your group of believers, right? In Buddhism, it's called a sangha. You have your community, and your community supports your religious specialists. Again, in Christianity, this is usually done through a tithe. And then you can support things like institutional bodies, which over time can amass vast amounts of wealth. And that's how you get things like the Catholic Church. In spirituality, you don't have any of that. What you have is just these individual spiritual practitioners. So they all just have to make money on their own. And I thought this was very interesting because I was like, well, that's actually very different to how most religions organize themselves. Because if you're going to have religious specialists, they are usually not engaging in economic activities. In fact, in some places and in some religions, it's pretty much it's either outright banned or frowned upon, right? In Protestantism, especially, part of the whole rejection of Catholicism was that, they weren't going to make money, right? They weren't going to sell indulgences, right? Especially the monasteries and all their economic activity, like making beer, was part of what was corrupted about the church. And this is the religious context that in America, spirituality is part of. So there's real like frowning on economics in any way. Yet spiritual practitioners have to earn a living, right? We're all living in
Right.
capitalism. We all got to get up in the morning and make a living, right? And they do the same as everyone else. So they do make money off their spiritual practice, right? And this can be a number of different ways, right? They, yoga teacher is an obvious one, right? Or running seminars or courses of somehow like kind of selling or imparting your knowledge for a fee, or how to do a practice of certain kind, teaching people how to do it. But what a lot of them were doing was using these new tools on the internet to make money. So I analyze them as basically like gig economy workers, right? Because what they're actually
Right.
doing is they have this whole talk of how they're like ascending to another dimension. But what they're actually doing in terms of their economic life is they are making YouTube videos. They are communicating with people via like video calls like we are now, in order to sell readings, for example, to do a psychic reading over a video chat. A lot of them made money that way. Or selling products online through things like Etsy or Instagram. A lot of them were trying to be basically influencers in one way or another. Some of them were very successful, right? If you got enough followers. But the fact is, in Sedona, it's a small town, it's about 10,000 people. You can only reach a certain number of people within that town. But when you use the internet, you can reach millions more. And in spirituality, the use of the internet has been absolutely pivotal for the growth of these forms because you can connect with people around the world, which allows you to support yourself, but it also allows communities to grow online. And since the explosion of social media, especially things like TikTok, it's only got bigger because they can just reach larger and larger audiences. There might be like one or two people in your average town who are interested in this kind of thing. But you multiply that by, the amount of people that you can reach via social media, and suddenly you can actually connect through a community and create that community. So that religious community ends up being there in the end, but they had to create it through the internet.
Right. And so where does Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow and the Jade Egg come into all of this? Because this is really how I first started reading about it, and I just find it fascinating, the whole story of the egg and all the kind of rhetoric around it. So could you just tell us a bit about your paper on that?
Yes. So Goop is the company of Gwyneth Paltrow, who's quite a famous actor. Or used to be. Again, I feel like all my
I
references
think
are
she's still
so she's
famous.
so famous. She was in some really big movies in the early 2000s. Anyway, she has a company called Goop. Goop is a lifestyle and wellness brand. It is a high-end one, right? If you look at things on the Goop website, they are expensive, right? You want a little packet of like supplement powder, it's like $60. And they sold this egg. It's called a yoni egg. There's one that's made of jade and there's one that's made of rose quartz. Now, if you're into spirituality, this will already be starting to ring bells, right? These are called crystals. Technically, geologically speaking, they're minerals. But in spirituality, if it's a pretty looking rock, you call it a crystal, right? And quartz is a very commonly used crystal, right? Crystals are conduits for energy, right? So you want to use your crystals as part of raising your vibration and your energy, right? So they're very, very common. So Goop sold this one, and it was specifically a yoni egg, right? Which means it was used to be inserted in the vagina. So there was kind of a wellness claim here and a spiritual claim. The wellness claim is this is going to tone your Kegel muscles. This is not true, by the way. And there are gynecologists who've argued that it's actually a great way to just like introduce bacteria, so you shouldn't use
Oh,
them. I want to just put that disclaimer there. The spiritual claim is sort of this will help you like rebalance your feminine energies, your chi, right? And all of this language was in the marketing materials that Goop sold this egg for. I think it was something like $65 for what is basically a small rock about that big. Maybe a bit smaller. They said it was sort of this ancient Chinese secret that, the concubines and the empresses of ancient China had used it, right? So this in esoteric terms is this sort of ancient wisdom or ancient knowledge. That's what they're tapping into. The idea that long ago in various cultures, not ours, right? Not European cultures, but non-European cultures had these secrets that we have now lost because we've been corrupted with basically industrial society. So we don't have our connection to industrial wisdom anymore. That's why you have to reconnect through these other cultures' practices. So ancient China, they assume, has this wisdom. It was known obviously by the royal family, blah, blah, blah. Again, none of this has any evidence, right? If you're someone who like actually reads ancient Chinese texts, none of this makes any sense. It's all marketing. So I kind of found this as an interesting case study for how esotericism works in kind of economic exchanges, which, as I already mentioned, esotericism is very much studied by historians, and a lot of them don't have a lot of interest in political economy or issues of class or anything like that, really. So it's not something that's been written about a lot in esotericism, but I was like, actually, it's it's there and it should be incorporated into our analysis. And I thought the jade egg showed that how ancient knowledge, this idea that there's secret hidden wisdom from other cultures far in the past, can be a marketing claim, essentially, to sell something which in its form is already basically sold throughout the kinds of wellness and spiritual circles who would buy this, right? It's what they would call a crystal, right? And the idea that you can do things to improve your sexual health is also quite strong in these circles. So it's kind of tapping into these sort of contemporary cultural ideas in spirituality, but using this claim of like secret, hidden, ancient knowledge as the marketing claim for why it will be persuasive, even though what it's doing is quite contemporary. And that's basically it. I mean, there's more about what happened with Goop. Basically, a lot of people complained about both the price and like the sort of, especially the questionable medical claims of this jade
Right.
egg. I think part of it was also sort of the sort of what do you call it, the factor that it was being inserted in vaginas was part of why it got picked up by the media, right? There was this sort of
Right.
like, oh, look, they're doing something weird kind of
Yeah.
aspect to the outrage that it sparked. But yes, Goop got sued for the claims they were making. They very quickly took this product off the market and they stopped selling it. But you can still find all kinds of eggs and all kinds of claims being made about crystals in spirituality. If you go to a crystal store, you will see yoni eggs, and you'll see the other version is lingam eggs. Those are for guys.
Oh, right. Okay.
You don't necessarily insert them anywhere. I would,
Oh, okay.
but
I'm
maybe,
glad to
but
hear
yes,
that.
yeah, but yeah. So it's all about crystals that can help and improve your sexual energy, though. So that is basically the whole thing about the jade egg. And I thought it was sort of interesting to kind of look at this from this perspective of kind of, is spirituality neoliberal, right? Because the idea about, a lot of people be like, what is neoliberalism? And there's a lot of different ways to define neoliberalism, again, but I tend to see it as a specific series of policies. And those policies, which were implemented in the late 70s and the 1980s, first in Britain and America, and then they were opposed worldwide, did a number of things, such as cutting welfare states, such as cutting taxes, but that also meant cutting funding to public services, often privatizing those services. And also this sense of financialization, right? Which is that anything is for sale on the free market, right? It doesn't matter what it is, anything can be sold. So is this sort of a neoliberal product, or why is spirituality more generally neoliberal? Is at least my argument is that in spirituality, it's this religious form that justifies all of the political economic policies that characterize neoliberalism. It sort of makes it okay on a spiritual level to be individualistic, to be able to sell anything, including things that are meant to be sacred, on the market, right? Because there's this sense that, at least in spirituality, because everything has energy, money also has energy. So it's
Oh,
kind of
right.
okay, right? It's totally okay to amass vast amounts of wealth. And if you have done so, in fact, that makes you a manifester, right?
Oh,
So
so
it
I
means
was
you're
just
sorry.
today, just came across your article on manifesting, and in that
Yes.
you were saying that different types of money have different energies. Am I right there?
Well, different forms of exchange,
Oh,
not
right. Okay.
necessarily different types of money. So the lowest forms of exchange in terms of their kind of vibration are actually ones that involve currency. So if I buy something from you for money, that's quite a low vibration. But if we trade that item, it's got a higher vibration because we're not using currency. However, if I amass lots of wealth, and they think about wealth not just in terms of having lots of money, but just it could be spiritual wealth, it could be kind of love. They call it abundance, right? But that shows something about you, that you are a manifester. And that means that in a way, you deserve the things you have, right? So in spirituality, there's this idea that you create your own reality. So if I have an abundance of wealth, then that means I've created that reality for me. So I'm very good at manifestation. So someone like Gwyneth Paltrow will be held up not just because she used to be an actor, but because she is so successful, right? Being successful in and of itself shows that you're doing spirituality well because you created this wonderful reality for yourself. Now, the opposite of that is that if you are poor, you also deserve it. They
Right.
don't really like to say that part out loud. But there are definitely certain forms of spirituality that tend towards a prosperity consciousness, which is sort of like a new age version of the prosperity gospel, which is common in
Right. Yeah.
evangelicalism. The idea that God has blessed you if you are rich. But in spirituality, it's that, well, you've clearly got a very high vibration because you have got the things you want in this reality that you created. They don't like to think of it in terms of currency though, because as I said, they see that as quite a low vibration. That's seen as quite, they call it third dimensional, which is like the dimension we live in now. So the aim is to try and get to this higher dimension.
Okay. Wow. I never knew that about money.
Yeah.
And there was one thing I was thinking about when I was reading your paper, the one about Goop, which was there was like a couple of lines where you talked about that when Goop had this kind of backlash, that I think it was their spokesperson or somebody came out and said that what they were doing was they were sort of addressing the needs of women who have been kind of marginalized and ignored by mainstream medicine. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of all of this, is that that's a real problem, right, in real life, And I don't know if it feels like some sort of that at the root of it, there is a genuine problem, although all the Goop way of doing things seems to be no real solution to that problem.
Right. So there is a problem with the marginalization of women's health in general. It is, and these things are studied by medical social sciences. It is much harder to get treatment if you're a woman. Women's problems, right, are seen as less of a priority to medical professionals. Women doctors tend to get sidelined to gynecology and obstetrics because, again, these are women's problems and they are paid less on average if they are in those specialisms than, men who are surgeons. So there's all different levels that gender inequality works in medical systems. And this is very true. Like, women have all these very like persistent chronic problems that just are not studied and there's very little help for, which if you sat and listened to women complain about their various chronic health problems, that you'd be appalled that just the amount that is not, it's not studied, so therefore the treatments aren't there. So then when you do go to the doctor, they don't really know what you're talking about, and so they tend to just dismiss you. So this is a real problem. It is not, as you said, solved by Goop, right? Especially because the most marginalized women are not buying Goop products, right? They're
Right.
not spending $60, right? Which could be, a week or two's food budget on a jade egg. So, it's sort of a sleight of hand by Goop, I think. I think it's just like them trying to do good PR. Like, oh, you're persecuting us because we're standing up for women, which is a great PR move, but it's not really true. They're not standing up for women's health. They're selling very expensive wellness products to affluent women, which is quite different, actually.
Yes. And I think that again is interesting because you talk in the paper about the sort of elitist aspect of all of this, right? With the whole thing about that this is supposedly own as that this is secret knowledge that is now accessible, but so long as you have the money to pay for it, right?
Yeah. I feel like this is an axe I've had to grind with the subject of esotericism for quite some time. So in esotericism, there's kind of all this debate about how do you define it? Like, what is it? Is it secret knowledge? Is it rejected knowledge? And when I look at the sorts of trends studied in esotericism, I'm like, well, actually, a lot of the time, what it is elite knowledge. Especially if you go back far enough, then it's restricted to literate, wealthy, often men in centers of learning in Europe. And that is pretty much who's studied under esotericism. And I also mentioned that people tend to look down on contemporary esotericism and New Age. And this is because one of the things that happened in the 20th century was that a lot of these forms got democratized. They got far more popular. And with being popularized, a certain type of person started looking down on them as having been polluted, right? Astrology is a great example of this. Astrology used to be a very elite practice, right? There were court astrologers. John Dee is a famous one, was the astrologer for Elizabeth I. And now anyone with a smartphone can read a chart, and they've kind of become this very popularized, and now again very associated with women, this idea of horoscopes, that astrology now, what it does is tell you about yourself and your various compatibilities with the people around you. And this is not what astrology was if you look at, for example, the early modern period. So there's this sense that when esoteric practices become more widely available, they sort of lose some of their cachet. And I found this sort of looking down on contemporary esotericism, I found it deeply annoying, honestly. And then I started to wonder, where is this coming from? And I was like, well, maybe the way you define esotericism is, in fact, it's an elite practice, right? Right? What is secret, hidden knowledge? Well, it's that's only available to a few people and who have the very specific skills, whether that's literacy, if we're talking about the early modern period, it's money, if you're talking about now, who have access to these practices. And that's exactly what Goop is selling as well, right? If you're selling, a crystal, which is just a mineral, which is someone who's dug up the ground, the person who has dug it up from the ground, there's a very high likelihood that that person is grossly underpaid. The amount of things like child labor in the supply chains of what are called crystals, which are actually minerals, is disgusting. But these things are then moved into the markets for sale in Europe and America. They get this very high price tag, and Goop is one of the companies, not the only one, that then takes advantage of that by saying, well, these have special properties, right? They're going to do these wonderful things to you, but only if you have the money to pay for it. And it's sort of it's a form of literacy, but like the idea that what they're saying is meaningful, right?
Right.
Because I can think of plenty of people I would try and say, well, look, there's this egg. If you insert it, it's going to do something for you. They would just be like, what are you talking about? But if you're an affluent white woman who's into wellness practices, I'll be like, oh my gosh, ancient Chinese secret. These are meaningful categories for them, right? It will make sense to them. So that's what I mean. It's sort of like a spiritual literacy. Is it a literacy in the kind of practices of spirituality? And so it is elitist. It's absolutely elitist. And partly what they're trading on is the fact that these products are not available to most people. And, if you called them what they are, right? Bits of rock dug up by child laborers, then that doesn't sound very glamorous, does it?
Not
So
very.
it's been converted through marketing practices and through these ideas, these stories, which are, again, mostly stories of it being the secret, powerful, magical item known since, tens of thousands of years or thousands of years or whatever they're claiming, then it has this cachet, right? And that's how you convert something that is just a rock into something that you can sell for far more money. It's the same with diamonds, by the way. That's another rant I have.
And I feel like I should finally talk about conspiracy theories because that is
Oh, yeah.
ostensibly what this series is about. So you've said you've done a bit of research, or are you currently undertaking research on conspiracy theory stuff in the southwest of England? I don't know if can you talk about that, or is it kind of still in the pipeline?
It's all still very much in the pipeline. I'm actually trying to write my second book right now, and then I'm going to go on
Oh,
to study people in the Southwest and what I like to call counter narratives, which is a more polite term than conspiracy theory.
right.
But basically, right, I can tell you where all this comes from. So the last chapter of my book is all about conspiracy theories because I discovered that people in Sedona, as well as being in spirituality, they're also really into conspiracy theories. They would tell me, you can't drink the tap water because of fluoride. And I'm like, what's wrong with fluoride? Isn't that the good stuff in toothpaste? No, fluoride to them is poison, right? You have to take things like a substance, or it's actually a supplement rather, called chlorella to help detox yourself from the effect of chemtrails. Chemtrails is this idea that the government is spraying pollutants. They call them heavy metals, but they say it's aluminum, if we're being American, which aluminium is not actually a heavy metal. So I find it really hard to describe these things in the way they talk about them because there's a lot of things you have to kind of clarify. But so the government is using airplanes with secret canisters in the wings to spray these, what they call heavy metals, into the atmosphere, and that is poisoning us all. Some people call it aerial spraying. And that poisoning is either going to control our minds, turn us all into mass shooters, perhaps, or make us all very sick. They call it chemtrail flu. So these ideas of this kind of pervasive environmental pollution are very, very common amongst people who also engage in spirituality. Now, the environmental conspiracy theories tend to have real world analogs. It is not so crazy to think that planes are doing something incredibly damaging to our atmosphere, right? That's how we get climate change. But they also tend to engage in political conspiracy theories. And this is something that's become much more prevalent, especially since COVID. And this is where it crosses over with the environmental and medical conspiracies. So people who are involved in spirituality always rejected vaccines for at least for as long as I've been doing research on them, which is over 10 years now. Vaccines are poison, right? They cause autism, they do all kinds of bad things, so they wouldn't vaccinate themselves, their children, or their pets, which are really bad, actually. So then when COVID comes along, right, they're being told to stay inside, which means they can't go out in nature. So they have this idea that healing comes from being out in nature, from your natural immune system and the food you eat, right? So being told to stay inside for lockdowns. Again, in America, they weren't really lockdowns like we had in Britain, but anyway, it was like to the people who believe these ideas about natural health and natural immunity, telling you to stay inside is insane, right? It's completely against the way they think health and immunity work. And then to cure this so-called disease as they saw it, you have to get a vaccine, which they think is poison. Well, to them, this clearly is a big lie, right? Obviously part of the conspiracy theories that they already believed in. And then, because we were all online a lot during the pandemic, they really got very influenced by people spreading QAnon conspiracy theories, which is this idea that there's a deep state that is trafficking children and harvesting a substance called adrenochrome, which again, I mean, it exists, but you'd have to harvest massive quantities to have any effect. So it doesn't really, like, it's all a bit bonkers when you look into it too closely. But that doesn't matter, right? The idea is that the government is evil, basically, and that the person who is good is, and this is where it gets really weird, Donald Trump, right? And that Donald Trump is
Right.
battling the deep state. So people involved in spirituality then suddenly gain this like commonality with people you wouldn't think they would ever get along with, kind of evangelical Christians and Christian nationalists and well, you know, Trump supporters. And they started saying things like Trump is a light worker. Right, a light worker is someone who's like actively raising the vibration of not just themselves but the whole planet. Right, they're really doing something beneficial to us all. And a lot of it that was to do with their opposition to vaccines and their response to mitigation measures in general. A number of them thought that COVID as a whole was a hoax. And the reason why these ideas have such currency amongst these communities is because what you and I would call conspiracy theories, right? To them, it's actually closer to what you might call a theodicy. Now, a theodicy is an explanation of evil, right? Why does evil exist? And this is especially problematic if you've already decided that everything is good, right? If God is all powerful, why does evil exist? Now, in spirituality, it's that, you know, why hasn't the New Age happened, right? If we're all working so hard to create this new era of peace and love and spirituality, and it's going to happen and it's inevitable, well, why hasn't it happened yet? And so conspiracy theories are the reason why spirituality or the new age of spiritual harmony and peace has not happened yet. Because the conspiracy theories are explanations for why we're being held in the third dimension. And when I was first in the field, they really focused on ideas like the reptilians. This is kind of going to get into a bit of alien talk here, but reptilians are a race of aliens.
Is this the David
Icke? Yeah.
Right,
So
yeah.
David Icke came up with the reptilians, and he said that there's a kind of global elites, the royal family of reptilians. So these kind of, again, this gets a bit racist and anti-Semitic, dark-skinned, lizard-like people. And at least the way David Icke talked about reptilians is you didn't see their real face, right? They hid as humans, but they were really reptilians. So people involved in spirituality were quite influenced by this because there's a lot of UFO and alien lore and ideas that are very popular in these circles. So the reptilians were holding back the New Age. They also talked about the Dark Cabal. So it's this idea of kind of these dark, shadowy forces who are holding us back. And then this idea of the deep state really took over once COVID came along. And that idea of the deep state came from QAnon, but it really mapped onto pre-existing conspiracy theories. And in a conspiracy theory, there's always a group of conspirators. And there's just different names for who this group of conspirators are. And in spirituality, the idea is that the conspirators want us to stay in the third dimension because they benefit from us, right? They're wealthy individuals, right? Yeah, again, the royal family pops up a lot, but also like heads of corporations, people with a lot of money, right? Because money is this very third dimensional form of exchange. So they're the ones really trying to hold us back and hold us down and stop trying to literally sever our connection to what they think of as source or spirit, right? And they would talk about it in terms of calcifying the pineal gland, which again maps onto what then QAnon started saying about adrenochrome, which allegedly also comes from the pineal gland. So there were all these sort of crossovers, and my theory is this all comes from them kind of moving in the same online circle. So a lot of these ideas got borrowed back and forth and sort of developed alongside each other. But that's why people who are involved in spirituality are super into conspiracy theories, because for them it's not a conspiracy theory, right? It's sort of part of their religious worldview. And that's what I'm going to study next, probably. Although I'm thinking I will probably approach it more from a kind of approach of kind of getting people to talk about their ideas about health and wellness.
All of this, I kind of feel, was really kind of symbolized really well in, I get maybe not really well because that makes it sound like it was a good thing, but the January Capitol riots in 2021, right? With the
QAnon
QAnon
shaman.
shaman, right? It sort of
Oh my
embodies this whole
God.
kind of coming together of
He sure does.
spirituality and conspiracism.
He sure does. I actually have an article where I write about him because he's from Arizona, right? He's
Oh,
from
right, okay.
Scottsdale in Arizona. Yeah, he actually like went to high school. This is so stupid, but he went to high school with my ex-husband's cousin's wife.
Wow. Okay.
He's like a real Arizona character. But yeah, so he calls himself both a shaman and a starseed. And as soon as I saw that guy on the Capitol siege images, I was like, he is, he is one of these spirituality people. I like knew it. I wrote about it for Religion Dispatches at the time. But yes, he is absolutely kind of emblematic of this crossover. Because he's like he grew up as a Bush Republican in Phoenix. Like, and Arizona is a very Republican state. So he kind of has this like upbringing in this kind of very like law and order, like national security, like fiscal conservative. But then he like started taking magic mushrooms and other psychedelics as a teenager. I think there was also some like family issues he had to deal with that were traumatic. And this sort of like sent him on a different path entirely. And he then started dressing up in this kind of furry headdress and doing these shaman chants. And yeah, he calls so shamanism is a very contested category. It means very, very different things in different parts of the world. But what it means in spirituality is pretty much if you want to claim that you're a person who communicates with spirits, and pretty much anyone can claim they're a shaman. As I said, in spirituality, it's different in different cultures, which is why it's sort of a difficult category to talk about. And he also calls himself a starseed. So a starseed is a person who's an alien in a human body, and you're a number of different starseeds. There's a whole chapter in my book about starseeds. So yeah, Jake Angeli is also a starseed. That's the QAnon shaman's. It's not actually his real name. His real name is Jacob Chansley, but his preferred name is Jake Angeli because Angeli is to do with being an angel.
I
So
see.
he is deep involved with spirituality, and he used to just protest against outside the Arizona Capitol building in Phoenix. He also used to protest at a particular mall because this mall had like a symbol on the ground, which he said was a QAnon symbol to do with child
Oh,
trafficking.
right.
And he would carry around this sign saying "Q sent me," and then he shows up right in the middle of the Capitol siege.
Wow.
Yeah,
I've
went
been
to jail,
I've
got released. Oh, and now
oh,
he's like now he's like a real Trump movement like again, an influencer, right? He does like podcasts, he has merch. Yeah.
right. Well, God.
Yeah.
I suppose just to finish off then, that I'm thinking ahead now to like later this year, obviously, there's going to be another election in America,
I know.
and Trump is potentially going to come back, right? And so
Yeah.
just to kind of bring this episode to a close, do you think that all of these things that we've been talking about today, of I guess bits of QAnon or spirituality, esotericism, um, do you think they're still going to be as important this time around as they were in 2016 and 2020?
Um, it's really hard to say what's going to happen. I think I am actually meant to be doing a project, if I'm able to go to America, on conspiracy theories in Phoenix and the election. So they're going to be significant. I mean, they've sort of set this thing up in the Republican Party whereby whenever they lose, it's a rigged election. And that happened, not a lot of people paid attention to this, but it happened in the 2022 midterms, specifically in Arizona. The Republican candidates that lost sued, said they'd had the election stolen, that there was election rigging. So it's just whatever happens when Republicans lose now. So Donald Trump is going to stand. He's going to be their nominee. Whether he's in jail or not is a question I cannot answer, which is not something I thought I'd ever say. The Republican candidate might be in jail at the time, but he might be. It's entirely possible. But he's still going to be their nominee. He still has huge support. So as long as Trump is in the mix, there's going to be all of these sort of, because in QAnon, Trump really is the Messiah, quite literally. Like it's not an exaggeration or a metaphor. They think of Trump as the Messiah. He is saving not just the children, but America from the forces of evil, which is the deep state. So all of that is still going to be going on. And if he gets put in prison, they're just going to say he's a political prisoner being tortured by the deep state. So therefore, he must be right, because otherwise they wouldn't have had to put him in prison. So it's an entirely self-justificatory worldview. And there's much deeper roots to the polarization that we see now. I'm very fond of saying that, like, Trump's not the problem, he's a symptom. So
Right,
even if
yes.
Trump, I don't know, dies, I don't know, maybe he gets COVID again, and dies, they'll just find someone new to latch onto, because this sense of division in America and where that sense of division comes from is much deeper than just this figure of Donald Trump, who's more like a symbol that people have latched onto. But because of who he is, Trump really exacerbates and takes advantage of it, and especially the weirder sides like QAnon. He has no problem, right, reposting and retweeting QAnon posts, and they will say things which are QAnon like codes, and if you know it well enough, you'll hear it. And Trump said this, and people around Trump have used these signals, and they like to do this form of signaling. So they've really emboldened and empowered the sort of weirder fringe elements, which is not just QAnon, it's also the militias, it's also, Christian nationalism. So there's a lot of these currents going along, and that will just continue happening when we have the election. And basically, it's all going to go horribly whether Trump wins or loses, right? Because if Trump loses, they're going to say it was rigged, and they're probably going to try and overthrow the government again. If Trump wins, then Trump's president again.
Right. Well, I think we'll end it there on that very bleak note.
Sorry.
But no, it's okay. I mean, it's just honest truth, I suppose. Thanks to Susannah Crockford for giving me an excellent deep dive into the world of wellness, spirituality, and conspiracy theories. And please make sure to check out her podcast, Misinformation, which you can find on all the major podcast hosting platforms. Thanks again to you for tuning in to another episode of Academic Perspectives on Conspiracism. The soundtrack is Spy Music by Echo Cinematics, and I'll see you next time.